Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's episode is Season 4, Episode 15, or Episode 75 overall, Squidtastic Voyage and That's No Lady, both of which originally aired on Nickelodeon in the fall of 2006. We're still in that, late 2006 period. I think this is the last full packaged episode to completely air in 2006, because then you've got Best Day Ever, and then the rest of the end of season 4 was held over to 2007. So what a way to close the year out, huh? Let's start with Squidtastic Voyage. That's the episode that should be playing while you're listening to this commentary track, and it was written by Luke Brookshire, Tom King, and Danny McKaylee. And I believe this is like a fully season 4 introduced writers, pack on this episode, and I think they did a good job with this one. Shouldn't take a genius to figure out that this episode was influenced by the 1966 sci-fi movie Fantastic Voyage, and look, there's dozens of cartoon episodes about this. I've seen at least 57 others. I did that whole video a few years ago. Still my longest video of me just going through 2 hours worth of talking about Fantastic Voyage cartoons over the years, where they go in someone's body with a vessel, and I still don't exactly know why that movie became such a popular thing for cartoons to parody. I guess it was just an excuse to get some bodily subject matter on TV and frame it as like a parody of a classic movie. But yeah, this episode of SpongeBob is a bit grosser than usual for this point in time in the show's history, but yeah, I see that as like the parody as a reason to do that. It is kind of interesting how we've got SpongeBob and Squidward messing around with a sci-fi parody twice in this season already, because this episode does have SquidBob Tentacle Pants vibes in certain areas. It's also one of the first times we've got Sandy and Squidward interacting for a prolonged period of time, which is good. And I'll praise that a bit more as this episode goes on. So, yeah, they were on a kick. They knew what to do with these characters, and I don't think this episode is squidtastic per se, but it's squid. That's my new word, squid. It's Squidward, and it's good. It's that zone. Hello, brand new chamber of shrinkage that we'll only see for this episode, but yeah, gets the plot going. And even though this is like a parody of something, I can also tell that the writers have been doing their research on SpongeBob and sort of nipping certain elements from earlier episodes, because this whole scene coming up of Patrick goading SpongeBob into sneaking around Sandy's little chamber of shrinkage is eerily similar to, the start of Sandy's rocket, and you can kind of look at this one as it gets to the point faster, while Sandy's rocket's example is more atmospheric, We're spending more time in the rocket and understanding it, whereas this one, it's just one scene, and then we've got Patrick making the joke about shrink, because it's double meaning. It's reducing in size, and it's another name for a psychiatrist. Glad that they got to that joke before so many other shows, or maybe way after some other shows. I haven't seen every show in the world. And also bits and bobs of this, like, we've already seen Plankton going through SpongeBob's head in Plankton, and we're going to see it a couple times later. And this isn't the first time where characters are reduced in size, because, we've got Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4, where that's kind of the whole point of that episode. So, yeah, this episode is definitely a borrower. You couldn't imagine this being one of the first few episodes of the show. This is them, looking back at what worked and putting it through a new lens. Something I also really like about this episode is the animation. I've said it 100 times before, Season 4 is my favorite animated season of the show, and I think the backgrounds in this episode really work from like Squidward's interior view. You've got, that good sense of color theory in there. Green means nose, pink means brain. So in terms of characterization, I think this episode is kind of, a mixed bag. It's got great jokes, but the characters, not all of them are there. Some of them are off. Like SpongeBob, I think is fine. This isn't his best characterization of the season, but it does work. It gets the job done. He is a fairly flexible character at this point. Best thing about it is seeing Sandy and Squidward interact for a little bit in several scenes. And that's a good line read from Roger Bumpers, just that exasperated SpongeBob. And that's good animation too of him breathing. Gosh, there's always something to enjoy going back to this one. But yes, Sandy and Squidward do have similar views on SpongeBob in that he can be annoying, but also Sandy is more tolerant of SpongeBob, Squidward is far less so. So you could see them as coming from a certain demeanor, but the way that they work, the way that they live through that demeanor is different. And that sort of comes through in, the way that they interact in this episode. You've got some really good jokes coming out of them, like Sandy getting Squidward to sign some waivers while he's blind, and then Squidward retaliating by kicking her in the butt. But the worst thing about this episode is Patrick's characterization. This is maybe not the first instance in season 4 or even the whole show, but definitely one of the first where they're just kind of making him a menace to get easy jokes out of him. And it's kind of weird. They sort of flip-flop between sort of this mindless jerk who just makes things worse. But then you've got a small instance later on where he sort of adds on to what Sandy's saying as a way to, fix the plot of how to get out of Squidward's stomach. I like this little animation here of them jumping around the mind. But yeah, this is season 4. You do kind of see little glimpses of what they're going to do in the future. But overall, it's still a fine episode. You just kind of notice certain things starting to not necessarily take over the show, but intrude on it. And I'm trying not to sound like a total sponge boomer because I just like pointing stuff like this out in animation, just in any TV show, just when this trend starts, when this trend ends, when certain writers come in or the animation changes. It's fun to study, One little fun fact about this episode is that there was a game based on this episode called Inner Voyage or something on Nick.com. It was one of those Flash games that I've been seeing a lot of videos about recently of them, just people going back to the SpongeBob Flash games over the years, and honestly, they are fascinating because even though I was a big SpongeBob fan as a kid, I never really went on Nick.com too often, so I never really played those games. So that's like a whole other dimension of being a SpongeBob kid back in the day. And yeah, that does sort of, maybe it elevates this episode, maybe it doesn't. But yeah. And in general, I think that this episode is quite cleverly plotted because you have got, SpongeBob and Patrick dancing at the start of the episode, and dancing somehow saves Squidward at the end of the episode, just cutting a rug and cutting the reed in two. But speaking of the start of this episode, it has saved lives. It has saved a few lives because if you look up SpongeBob Heimlich maneuver, you get a lot of news stories from all over the years. Like, there's at least one in 2010, one in 2015, of school kids saving their friends from choking by performing, the Heimlich maneuver or something like it, and saying, oh, I learned it from SpongeBob, I learned it from Squidtastic Voyage, this episode. So, whether or not you like this episode, you kind of have to thank it for saving some children's lives. I mean, you could probably say the same thing about any SpongeBob episode with that thing, because that's the funny thing about the way this episode starts. It sort of references SB129 with SpongeBob saying, oh, Squidward, you've swallowed your clarinet again, because it might just be sort of this random, oh, silly thing, this has happened before, or they could be explicitly, talking about SB129. It's kind of difficult to tell with SpongeBob sometimes what's a continuity nod and what's them just doing a wacky joke. So yeah, a little downer ending just to sort of piggyback off of SquidBob Tentacle Pants, though not nearly as gross as that one, not nearly as disturbing. A little gross because it ends with a very classy poop joke, but it's a funny visual. Squidward with a whole submarine in his belly. I'm happy that I still have cool things to go back to with this episode. It keeps on giving. It's one of those. I can't exactly say the same thing for That's No Lady, written by Casey Alexander, Chris Mitchell, and Stephen Banks. So, like Wigstruck, this was originally released on the Whale of a Birthday DVD on Halloween 2006, but it premiered on Nickelodeon on November 25th, 2006. I believe that was the Thanksgiving weekend, because that had a few series finales of other shows. But, I'm kind of mixed on this episode. Not a lot of people would pick this up, but this one is also influenced by an old movie. It has shades of a 1959 comedy called Some Like It Hot, starring Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, and Marilyn Monroe. And the plot of that movie is two men flee from the mafia after seeing them do some shady stuff and getting threatened. So they dress in drag and go to this big musical. I don't know. I probably wouldn't, consider the movie a laugh riot like they did in the 50s. I watched the first half hour and got the gist of what the rest of it was going to be like. But I think that the Get Out of Town guy is recalling the mafia vibe of the plot of that movie. But also just sort of being a wacky misunderstanding. It would be a bit more if the Get Out of Town guy was reaching into his briefcase, and that is what set Patrick off. But then, there's the mislead. It's the Get Out of Town brochure or advertisement in there. I think that this episode has sort of a wacky misunderstanding start, and that's why I'm pretty conflicted on where it goes. Not the least of which just the whole idea of this episode of, Patrick dressing in drag and that being, the crux of the comedy in this thing. Now, there is definitely some things to say, some things to... Gosh, I'm not the best at talking about this sort of stuff in, cartoons, but you could sort of see this episode as talking about, gender and gender identity and, the struggles of womanhood to a certain, to a certain degree of, what would a woman go through in a workplace, and especially maybe someone who's just become a woman, who's just discovered themselves to be a woman. You see how it's kind of tough for me to, talk about this stuff on the spot. I mean as little offense or insult as possible, but there is a degree of that to the humor in this thing, and I can see that getting some divisive reactions as time goes on. I'm not personally offended by the text in any sense, but it is very 2000s. There was a lot of humor about this in the 90s and 2000s, just in a lot of comedy, especially adult comedy, and that sort of informs, perspectives and tastes and attitudes today. I'll get off this topic now because, like I said, I'm not the best at talking about it, but it is something to think about with this episode and something to scrutinize with it just a little bit more than most other episodes of its kin. But what are some little factoids and, little trivia morsels about this episode? Well, something I like about the Patricia design is that, it's green, obviously, because that was the color of Patrick's shorts, but it's also got a purple outline if you look close. So that's a good little bit of attention to detail. And for like one scene towards the end of the episode, it's got little clams on the chest part, the bra, and I don't know what those are called because I don't know, I'm uncultured, but yeah. Also kind of interesting about this episode is that Larry pops in just sort of as a litmus test to see if Patrick's disguise is effective, because he didn't exactly buy the Patrick disguise of just him and the sort of, the single-eyed sunglass thing. There's a name for it. I'm bad with names at the moment. But he does, see Patricia as an effective disguise. And it is kind of weird that, yet again, we've got Larry in season 4 in just this bit role, because I think we don't get an episode entirely set at Goo Lagoon in season 4. I think this is the first season in which it isn't, the prime location. There's a few little scenes of SpongeBob at the beach, but no episodes about Goo Lagoon, like Bubble Buddy or Sponge Guard on Duty, which, sort of limited what Larry could be capable of. So I think this is just the writers putting him in an episode and seeing what he can do. Another little appearance is from, a one-shot character called Mr. Seaweed Monster Man. It's a decent gag. It is a very weird design, but I think that's the joke. And as for how Squidward and Mr. Krabs are written in this episode, it is, kind of interesting, kind of not the best writing for them, because they've shown a limited interest in, women before this episode. We've got Krusty Love with Mr. Krabs, but he was a wreck at talking to Mrs. Puff at the start of that, whereas here he just launches straight first into Patricia. And Squidward also, I think this is the very first time he's been deeply interested in romance of any sort. He calls Patricia Rubenesque, which is a term about some old painter and who painted like big woman, and it's basically confirming Squidward likes him big. So take of that what you will and all that. Gosh, we've got a couple more minutes of Mr. Krabs and Squidward flirting with Patricia. The whole misunderstanding that it's not, they don't know it's Patrick in a disguise. And some of this just borders on harassment or, tiptoes into pure harassment. So it is kind of, not the most flattering depiction of Squidward or Mr. Krabs. You've got little things I like about, how Squidward and Mr. Krabs interact with each other in this episode. You've got Mr. Krabs, pulling out a megaphone and getting Squidward to hop back to his station. And that's a decent little gag between them. But this episode is just a gag fest. I feel like the whole crux of the humor is a product of its time, and the get out of town guy, the whole wacky misunderstanding thing is just sort of, it only works because Patrick is dumb enough to do that. Honestly, I think my favorite scene in this episode is, the part in the start of SpongeBob and Patrick trying to, cope with this and figure out a way to, disguise Patrick before they land on Patricia. Because, you've got that heart there, you've got that spirit there, they're setting up that, they're gonna miss each other and they've got to really work together to figure something out. And I do like just how lame SpongeBob's list is in this episode. He's had a couple really cool lists over the years, but that one is just a whole day schedule of just doing things with Patrick. Just do this with Patrick, do that with Patrick. I think that is, for this episode, a good joke about how devoted he is to Patrick and how devoted he is to, keeping him around in his life. But it also sort of runs into the new Leaf problem of this episode aired 18 years ago. This cannot be the last appearance of this or that character or a big status quo change. So I don't know exactly how Some Like It Hot goes or how it ends, but I'm guessing it is sort of like this with the Mafia coming back and, the musician guys having to reveal that they're in disguises. As for what I think of Patricia, it's a fine disguise, but part of the episode falls apart when you have to, understand that Mr. Krabs and Squidward can fall for it. They use Larry as a litmus test. I get it, but Mr. Krabs and Squidward are far more familiar with Patrick, so it just sort of, doesn't make too much sense. I know it's SpongeBob, it doesn't make the most sense in the world, but yeah, it does kind of make them seem a bit dumber and worse than usual just for falling for this and suddenly treating Patrick better when they think he's a woman. And yeah, you sort of understand why the show has hardly done jokes of this vein before this, because I just don't think they're the best at that. So that is Squidtastic Voyage, and That's No Lady. My question time for you this week is, what's your favorite Fantastic Voyage episode in a cartoon, any cartoon? There's been a lot of good ones over the years and a lot of really stinky ones over the years. I did a lot of that in, the big old Fantastic Voyage one. The conclusion I came to in that video was that Parasite's Lost from Futurama is my favorite, but I want to hear from you. Last time, the question is, what's your favorite movie from within SpongeBob? And I've got a lot of good answers. Random Lad says, the single-cell drama from Patty Hype. That is pretty good, even though we only see a few seconds of it. Sparkling with Nights, the real Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy movie, without a doubt, manages to be much better than any modern Marvel films. Listen, I never got on the Marvel train, but I have heard that they've really fallen off this decade, so maybe that, quip lands. Brendan Barney said, Simple Night of the Robot from Crabborg. Glad someone's on my side. Ingagelmations, you need a high IQ and deep level of artistic knowledge to truly enjoy The Table. My guy knows. Snake Man asks, was the Anemone video from Your Shoes Untied considered a film? I don't know if they would air that on TV. And Bryce Form says, my choice is the exact same as Brendan Barney's, GBH. Again, good choice. Yeah, I'm so happy when people agree with me and discussion can't go forward. That's it for SpongeComs this week. Next time, Squidward seems to have become a lot of things in The Thing and Hocus Pocus. Goodbye for now.